Hello and welcome back to another episode of Lovehorsepower.com. Last time we showed you how to remove the head to replace the head gasket on this 91 MR2 Turbo. Today we're going to be showing you how to clean the head, remove the valve springs and valves, and get those valves cleaned up. We also noticed that the oil pan gasket is leaking on this MR2, so we're going to show you how to remove the oil pan without completely removing that exhaust. And since we got the oil pan off, well, we'll also show you how to remove a piston too. But first, let's go take a look at that head and get started. Now that we've got the head removed, we need to get this thing seriously cleaned up. On the intake side, the valves don't look too dirty, but we'll remove them anyway so that we can replace those valve stem seals. The exhaust valves are really dirty though. We gotta get those things cleaned up and reclaim that horsepower. First, let's take off those camshaft pulleys, the number 3 metal timing belt cover, and the idler pulley. Next up, we can unbolt those bearing caps. Each camshaft is held in place by 5 bearing caps with 2 bolts each. Use the service manual to remove the bolts in the correct order and loosen them in several passes. Do this with each camshaft, 20 bolts in all. Keep the bearing caps and bolts in order and in the orientation they were in when they were installed. When you reinstall the camshafts, the bearing caps go back exactly where they came off from and in the same orientation. To remove the shim and bucket assembly is really easy. Just use a magnet and pull them out. As with everything else, we'll take off the head. Don't forget to keep them in order. Using a valve spring compressor tool such as this one and a piece of cut copper pipe from the local hardware store, compress the valve spring. Once the valve spring is compressed, use a magnet to pull out the valve keepers or retainer clips. Let's check it out. As we saw earlier, remove the shim and bucket assembly using the magnet. Now get your piece of copper pipe and position it on top of the valve retainer. Position the valve spring compressor tool on top of the copper pipe. Now I like to hold my hand over the pipe to prevent the keepers from popping out. These little guys are really easy to lose. Then compress the spring. Now get that magnet again and pull out those keepers. Then uncompress the spring and remove it along with the retainer. Now get to it. You've got 15 more to get done. Once the valve spring assembly is removed, you can remove the valve. Just push it from the top of the valve stem, through the valve stem seal, and out the bottom. Take a look at that exhaust valve. It's got some seriously hard, horsepower robbing carbon buildup. Using some needle nose pliers, twist and pull off those old valve stem seals, and get rid of them. Whoa! Look at those combustion chambers. They need a serious cleaning. You know what I see? I see horsepower about to be reclaimed. You can use a semi-soft wire brush to get it most of the way clean. Then clean the whole thing up with brake cleaner. Don't use the brake cleaner in your lawn. It makes wives very unhappy. Make sure you finish cleaning it up before installing new valve stem seals. So, check it out. See what a little time and elbow grease can do? To keep yourself motivated, just think of all that yummy, delicious horsepower you'll have. And keep in mind the hot spots you're removing from the combustion chamber that can promote detonation. Now we can replace those valve stem seals with new ones. Put some clean engine oil on the seal using your fingers or an oil pump, and then use needle nose pliers or magnet and gently place the seal onto the valve guide. And simply use your fingers to push the seal into place. Let's take a look at that one more time. With the valve removed, we can get to cleaning it. I'm using a standard drill and a brass wire brush. Place the drill into a vise, crank it up, and clean all that carbon off of the valve. Be sure not to scratch the valve stem, just clean the valve face. Alright, with all the valves clean, let's review how to reassemble. Okay, this is the 3S GT head. Now here's a typical valve spring assembly on the intake side. And here is an intake valve. This is the valve stem. And here's this little groove here where these retainer clips fit to hold the valve in place. This is the valve seat. Now the intake valve comes in through the bottom and up through the valve stem seal. And the spring assembly goes down in there over the top of that. You then compress the spring down, and with the spring compressed, you put in these clips to hold it in place. Once that's done, you take the bucket, which contains this shim to adjust the valve clearance, and place that on top. To reassemble the head, get your nice clean valve and lube it on up with some engine oil. You know you like to do it. Everyone likes Slick Mobile 1 on their fingers. Insert the valve through the guide and the new valve stem seal. Now take the valve spring and retainer assembly and drop it over the top of the valve. Use that spring compressor tool we showed earlier along with a piece of copper pipe. You can pick up that copper pipe piece at your local parts store and just cut it to the appropriate length. Now compress the spring down using the tool. I used a slightly magnetic screwdriver to hold the keepers or clips and then drop them into the retainer. It takes some time to get it right, but you'll get it eventually. You've got 15 more to do. Once the keepers are lined up with the valve stem groove, uncompress the spring and you're done. Time to move on to the next one. Crap. Okay, we finally got our head removed. Now next, we had to get the head as clean as possible, and to do that, we had to pretty much remove everything we can off of this head. We started by removing the camshaft pulleys, the camshaft bearing caps, and the camshafts themselves. Then removed the shim and buckets, and used a valve spring compressor to compress each spring and remove the retainer clips, the valve spring, the valve, and finally the valve stem seal. Next, we used a drill and a wire brush to clean the valves and the valve stem seal. We then cleaned the combustion chambers as well as possible to remove any carbon or any other dirt in there that could make hot spots, which could promote detonation. Now next, we then had to reassemble the head. So we used new valve stem seals and used that spring compressor tool we showed earlier to compress the springs, put those retainer clips back in, and then put the shim and bucket back on top. Now, next, we're going to reassemble the head outside the engine by putting the camshafts back in, the camshaft bearing caps, and the camshaft pulleys. Now this time around, we're going to be using ARP hardware to assemble the head to the block, which should prevent any problems with the head lifting from the block. So what do you say we get this thing reinstalled?